Hello friends, welcome to CEC live lecture. Dear friends, in our previous session yesterday, we talked on theory on state in comparative politics, and today we are going to talk on debate on state in comparative politics, though some of the portion regarding the theory was left untouched, and we will try to give you the elaborate insight into the theory part also, but specifically we are going to discuss on debate on state in comparative politics. And for this discussion on the topic, we have with us in our studios Dr. Satish Kumar Jha. Dr. Satish Kumar Jha is Associate Professor in Department of Political Science, Aryabhatta College, University of Delhi. Dr. Satish Kumar Jha is one of the most dynamic professors who has immense experience as well as knowledge too, and he believes in giving most of his knowledge to the students. Therefore, through this live platform, he believes in giving his maximum. Friends, if you want to ask questions from Dr. Satish Kumar Jha on today's topic, then do call us through our toll-free number. Our number is 1800110430. I repeat, our number is 1800110430. Now, I would like to request Dr. Satish Kumar Jha to carry the lecture forward. Hello, sir. Welcome to the lecture.
Thank you, Veetikaji, and good afternoon. Today's lecture will be continuation of what we discussed in our earlier part on theory and debate on state in comparative politics. And in fact, the two issues which I posed in my very first presentation, that was the theory part of the state, that what are the different ways in which a state has been understood and perceived, particularly in modern time. But at the same time, also presented an evolutionary trajectory of the evolution of the state in human history, particularly from the ancient Greek period to the modern times, and accordingly how the thinkers and the theories have emerged, explaining nature, characteristic, origin, and so on and so forth. But particularly in modern context, I was emphasizing the importance of this theme for comparative politics, particularly after it emerged as a very important branch of political science, and therefore how comparative politics scholars, in other words, one can say how the comparativists have looked at this question of state formation, functions of a state, theories of a state, and how that has resulted into a very lively debate among scholars. That was basically the concern of these two parts lecture on theory and debate on state in comparative politics. In the earlier part, as I was mentioning, there are two ways in which one can look at this entire issue. Particularly after I mentioned Treaty of Westphalia of 1648, when there is a general consensus that this entire idea of modern nation state crystallized, and after that I also mentioned that how French Revolution of 1789 led to the formation of first modern state based on the principles of Treaty of Westphalia of 1648. A treaty which continued from 1648 to 1659 after the end of 30 years of war, that was the religious war in Europe. So therefore, French Revolution basically created the first Westphalian state in modern history with a monolithic, with a monolingual state with unitary features and a very defined territorial sovereignty and so on and so forth. So the first important Westphalian model, a state based on Westphalian model, basically emerged in France. Then also mentioned, earlier in my earlier lecture, that how an alternative model emerged in North America, and that was the after American War of Independence of 1776-77, and particularly after 1787 Philadelphia Convention, when USA Constitution took a definite shape. And United States of America, particularly through this revolution, that is War of Independence, made many innovative contributions for both the evolution of a modern democratic state and constitution, as well as for our understanding that how state authority, how state institutions can function within democratic setup, with written constitution, fundamental rights, separation of power, with federalism, and so on and so forth. So these innovations I also mentioned, particularly with reference to that famous celebrated text, the Federalist, 1787, published as in name of Publicius, the pen name of the authors, but exactly in fact the author were Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay. So they were Federalist paper. Along with that written document, that is the Constitution of United States of America, created a very important, powerful model so far as the modern state is concerned, United States, that sovereignty can be divided, instead of having a monolithic, a monistic concept of sovereignty. This entire new innovation believed in shared sovereignty, shared rule between the center and the states, and still being part of a nation state. So therefore it was an altogether different model. Then also mentioned that the third model which emerged was in Latin America. Particularly a lot of scholars believe that it was a post-colonial model of state formation, because when Spanish and the Portuguese colonies in Latin America rebelled against their masters, particularly in wake of the Napoleonic invasion during the Peninsular War of 1808 to 1814 in Europe, that led to basically a fierce war between Napoleon and France on the one hand, and the allied powers led by Britain, Spain and Portugal. And therefore what happened? That weakened both Spanish and the Portuguese state in Europe, and therefore in fact these colonies revolted against their masters, led to the liberation of many Latin American countries. And therefore what we find that resulted into the creation and formation of a different type of state, statehood in Latin America, which was neither purely, one can say, Westphalian, based on Westphalian principle, nor purely the federal principle of United States of America. It adopted unstable, garbled version of both civil and military rule, and therefore particularly 1800 onwards. And what we find that Latin America continued to offer a very mixed picture so far as this state formation is concerned. For example, some of the countries later on, particularly in 20th century, when socialism and communism became a very attractive ideology, some of the states in Latin America switched over to socialism. For example, Cuba, Nicaragua, and so on and so forth. But at the same time, many other countries remained under dictatorial military rule, and therefore a very mixed type of situation, one can say, prevailed in Latin America, particularly after the liberation of these Spanish and the Portuguese colonies. Then the next model I also mentioned was the Swiss model. That was the Switzerland, that how this American principle of shared rule, how a principle which didn't believe in the monistic concept of sovereignty, as perhaps it was understood and defined in modern times since Baudin, Hobbes and Austin, and that theory how influenced this entire concept of Westphalian model of the state formation after 1648, particularly the French state. In fact, this federal model, as I mentioned earlier, United States of America traveled to Europe, and the first federal experiment was made in Switzerland, and therefore one can refer it as a Swiss model in European context. 1848, the Swiss Confederation was formed, a federal state with autonomous, very autonomous cantons, a federal union of 4 linguistic communities, German, French, Italian, and Romance. And therefore, what happened? These 4 linguistic communities decided to form a federation, and therefore with many innovative democratic ideas and principles. For example, principle of direct democracy, perhaps the only country which initiated this process through initiative and recall. And therefore a collegial presidential federal model was established in Switzerland. So therefore you have the first major European federal state coming into existence in Europe, in Switzerland. In fact, interestingly, there are many other countries, for example, Britain, a unitary system, but nonetheless, one can say that recent trends suggest that how trend has initiated in direction of federalization, particularly Scotland and England. So that apart, what we find that Switzerland was the first important model. And then I also mentioned the Commonwealth model of state formation. Particularly when I talk of state formation, here I am not basically taking into account the historical evolution of a state. Rather, I am basically looking at it through the prism of democratic principles, through the prism of law and constitution, from the prism, through the greed of constitutionalism, one can say. And therefore, the next model one can mention here, if one discusses it from the point of view of constitutionalism, that is the Commonwealth model of state formation, or one can say Commonwealth model of statehood. And that was basically Canada of 1867, Australia of 1901, India of 1950, which was a combination of parliamentary and federal features, British and the American combination to great extent, of course, with many innovations, many deviations, but nonetheless this was the Commonwealth model. Then I also mentioned that in 50s and 60s, particularly after the Second World War, when decolonization happened, in light of this decolonization, many new models came into existence, which of course sometimes incorporated principles of this American and the French, but at the same time deviated also in the sense that didn't purely fit into that framework. And most of these states were in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. And that is what we call normally as the third world countries or the developing countries. Of course, many of them went for parliamentary unitary system like Sri Lanka and Kenya, and therefore, but later on, they deviated to parliamentary federal, for example, Ghana, Nigeria, South Africa, Malaysia, and so on and so forth. So this is how one can say in nutshell that how from the point of view of constitutionalism, state in comparative politics can be understood this way. But that is not the entire story. In fact, this constitutionalism as a governing principle of the state is basically essentially a liberal point of view so far as the comparative politics is concerned. As I mentioned in my earlier lecture also, that how this entire debate is ideologically colored and ideologically polarized and divided between the liberals and the Marxists so far as the discussion on a state in comparative politics is concerned. And therefore I mentioned that the liberal school of thought has been more innovative in the sense that they have from time to time they have tried to characterize the functions, nature and character of a state in modern times, in contemporary times. And accordingly, there has been proliferation of theories. Theories have mushroomed, particularly within liberal tradition. As and when there is a requirement, we find that a new point of view, new approach, new perspective emerges. And accordingly, as I mentioned earlier in my earlier lecture, that how system theory and structural functionalism also came to engage or came to in terms with this entire question of state in comparative politics, when they try to replace the category of a state with political system, and why they try to do it. I had mentioned and I had explained that how Almond basically believed that the state was an abstract category, and therefore there was a requirement for a more descriptive category which can describe and explain the entire authority system and power dynamics in society. And having having influenced by this entire Weberian tradition of legitimacy, power, authority, how Weber never basically believed in withering away of the state like the Marxist tradition believes. In fact, I will come to this issue, that how there is a debate within Marxism also on this issue of withering away of the state, seizure of a state and destruction of a state. But the Weberian tradition never believed it, and therefore, of course, through bureaucracy, through modern legal rational system, because Weber didn't directly discuss the nature, character and origin of a state, but discuss, of course, authority system, the traditional authority system, the charismatic authority system, and the legal rational authority system. And legal rational was the modern authority system, of which perhaps the modern state was a very important instrument. In fact, bureaucracy for Weber was a very important category to understand the power dynamics, the functioning, and the mechanism through which power operates in society within this entire state system. So therefore, Weber heavily influenced the comparative politics scholars, particularly coming from the liberal views, particularly coming from liberal tradition. And here, Almond and Easton, therefore, I had especially mentioned their contributions, particularly structural functionalism and the system theory in 50s and 60s. How they try to operationalize this category of system. Particularly, as I also mentioned, the challenge was to explain how to explain this, the expansion of global community, particularly after decolonization, when many erstwhile colonies became independent and they were trying to find out new paths for their democratic and economic journey. And it was in this context that the structural functionalism and system theory were trying to basically understand this phenomenon, and also trying to provide an ideal type to them, that what they should imitate, what they should follow, what would be a better option for them from the point of view of progress and development. So this is one aspect of this entire debate within liberalism on the statehood, that is the system and the structural functionalism. But it didn't remain confined to that, and therefore what we find that from the very beginning, this entire question of a state has been there in the liberal tradition, in the liberal theory, either in form of the origin of state, the theory of the origin of state, or how a state has originated. And I mentioned that in the modern time, the most important, powerful democratic theory came through the social contract theory, which tried to explain the origin of a state with reference to the consent of the people and through contract. Hobbes, Locke, and Rousseau. And Locke and Rousseau, I mentioned that how the concept of limited government, natural rights, and other things of Locke, along with the power of general with the direct democracy, the sovereignty of the people, how they became the hallmark of modern democratic theory. So combination of Locke and Rousseau, I had mentioned earlier that how provides a very important fulcrum on which perhaps the functioning of democratic state and the working of democratic state is analyzed by scholars in political science. So within liberal tradition, a debate has been very lively from the very beginning, not only on the origin of a state only, but also the functions of a state. And comparative politics essentially concerns itself with the functions and the working of the state, less with the theories of the origin of a state. Now, how a state functions, it is perhaps the main problematic. It is perhaps the main issue with which comparative politics engages. Unlike political theory, which also deals with the question of the origin, the historicity, or perhaps the philosophical dimension or argument about the origin of the state. So this function of a state, of course, is not a matter with which only the 20th century or scholars engaged in political science, particularly after comparative politics became a very prominent branch of the discipline. But even earlier we find, from very inception of liberal political theory, scholars were dealing with this question, and therefore I mentioned that how this entire thing has evolved from laissez-faire discourse of Adam Smith, Ricardo, and others, the classical political economists, to the welfare state of 20th century, particularly interwar period, Keynes and and the New Deal of Roosevelt, United States of America, particularly in the wake of Great Economic Depression, to a neoliberal version of the state, which is a combination of or drawing heavily on the resources of the classical political economy, the laissez-faire discourse, but at the same time with many new changes and many new innovations, with some imprint of Weber as well. So therefore, what we find that this entire debate on the functions of a state within liberal tradition has moved from laissez-faire to welfare to neoliberal, along with many new characterizations and new versions within liberal tradition are also available there. And I will basically try to briefly touch upon those issues and then move to the Marxist debate within the Marxist tradition, which normally is considered to be highly homogeneous, monolithic, which basically draws on the writings of Marx, which to great extent is true, and there is only one version of the state about the functions and the nature of a state, that a state is the managing committee of the bourgeoisie, as Marx perhaps mentioned in his Communist Manifesto, or perhaps that instrumentalist version, base superstructure, understanding of society and social formation, and a state becoming part of superstructure, having a secondary or subsidiary role vis-a-vis the base, that is economic structure of society, the mode of production. But that is not basically the whole picture. That doesn't give you the whole picture so far as Marxism is concerned. Within Marxism, there was a lot of debate on this issue. Marx himself engaged with this question, particularly in his critique of Gotha program, where he critiqued Lassalle, the German social democrat, as well as the Bakunin, the anarchist thinker. And along with that, in his civil war in France, 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte, all these writings, you find a lot of arguments, a lot of theories, a lot of insights coming from Marx so far as the capitalist state is concerned, and what type of approach the proletariat, the working class, would adopt. But later on, when Lenin, after Marx and Engels, when Lenin had to basically lead that Bolshevik revolution and had to create that socialist state, because there was no concept of a state in the socialist society, so to say. But then a transitional state they had to create in Soviet Union after the Bolshevik revolution, and it is here the concept of dictatorship of proletariat also emerged, which led to a lot of dissension, which led to a lot of criticism, which led to a lot of debate within Marxism itself. In fact, Kautsky, one can say Trotsky, and many other names come up. In fact, Rosa Luxemburg later. So I mean, all these things led to debate on the question of the statehood, and continued even later. In fact, many critics, like Milovan Julius, when he talked of, or Charles Bethlehem, when he talked of capitalist, and the capitalist state, So therefore, what we find out in Marxism, the debate was going on. But in late 50s, we find a very illuminating debate happened between the followers of Althusser, the German structuralist, like Bollinger, and the Miliband, who believed in the classical Marxist formulation, or one can say the orthodox Marxist position on a state, that is the instrumentalist version of a state, particularly when he wrote that famous book, A State in Capitalist Society. So Miliband-Bollinger debate of 50s and 60s, particularly 60s, becomes very important here from the point of view of Marxism, along with the contribution of Italian Marxist philosopher Gramsci through his concept of hegemony, that how ruling class rules. A state doesn't simply act as a coercive instrument of the ruling class, but how that hegemony is created through generation and formation of consent in the civil society. So this is how this debate within both liberal and the Marxist tradition has been highly enlightening, illuminating, and has been very lively, so to say, from the point of view of comparative politics. So in fact, what I have done, that I have recapitulated some of the issues which were part of our first part of our discussion, as well as it is in this context that this entire today's lecture is devoted to the question of theories and debate, which will be taking up in the later part of our lecture today.
With this note, thank you, sir. Thank you so very much. And dear friends, we have resumed the entire lecture of yesterday also, and we believe that you have learned a lot from this session. So, friends, be with us as we are going to continue the lecture further. We are back after a short break. Hello friends, welcome back in this session. Dear friends, in our previous session we have covered till the theory portion regarding both the liberalism and Marxism. Taking into account the liberalism and Marxism, we are going to discuss on the debate portion of state in comparative politics, and for this discussion we have with us in our studios Dr. Satish Kumar Jha. Dear friends, if you want to ask questions on today's topic from Dr. Jha, then do call us to our toll-free number. Our number is 1-800-110-430. Now, I would like to request Dr. Satish Kumar Jha to carry the lecture forward.
Thank you. In fact, this debate in the theory part we have to see in light of that how in modern times the state has been understood by scholars in political science in general and comparative politics in particular. Within liberal tradition, as I was mentioning, that this has to be seen in terms of the ideological debate initially. Then we have to see that how within both schools, ideological schools, how scholars differ in their perception, in their understanding, and in their characterization. How they not only describe, particularly the classical thinkers, not only describe the existing state, but also try to present a blueprint for a future possible state which would be in the interest of the society. So within liberalism, as I mentioned also, that this from laissez-faireism to neoliberalism is basically the evolutionary track so far as this state, the functions of a state is concerned. Now this Adam Smith, Ricardo Malthus, the classical political economists, looked at a state as a night watchman version of the state. Of course, from liberal theory, the reconciliation of interest is perhaps the hallmark of democratic politics, or for that matter any politics. Whereas from the Marxist theory point of view, a state is the product of class struggle, therefore it can never act as a neutral agency, which liberal theory believes that a state is autonomous, is neutral, it is above class interests, it is above the narrow sectarian interests of society, and therefore it is the interest of all. That is perhaps the most important contentious point between the two schools, because one believes that a state can never be neutral, but other believes that a state is a neutral agency, it acts in the interest of all. Whereas the Marxist school believes that a state always acts in the interest of the dominant class, the ruling class, the privileged class, because it is a product of the class struggle. And therefore, whosoever is powerful, whosoever has control on the means of production in society, they will necessarily have the control on the state institutions, state apparatus, and state agencies. And therefore, a state cannot defy the logic of the structure. So this is something very significant from the point of view of Marxist school of thought. But for liberals, a state is to be seen as an agency which is basically there to protect everyone in society, be it life, liberty, or property. And this is how the social contract theorists like Hobbes, Locke, and Rousseau understood it. Particularly Hobbes, the way he privileged security, and Locke, he privileged rights, but nonetheless a state was to act in interest of all. Of course, with Hobbes it was absolute state, whereas for Locke it was a limited state. But nonetheless, the understanding of a state was broadly within this framework of reconciliation and a kind of mechanism or available, because state is organization of power of society, organization which is basically meant to protect everyone's interest. So from that point of view, this laissez-faireism looked at a state as a night watchman, and therefore it also believed that the best government is which governs the least, and understood a state as a necessary evil though necessary because of human nature, because of human conditions. Similarly, one should also understand that this laissez-faireism led to a situation where a lot of inequalities, disparities, and a lot of unrest started surfacing in society, particularly the capitalist industrial society of Europe. And it was in this context that some alternative arguments were put forth, and John Stuart Mill was perhaps a very important proponent of this alternative point of view, who believed in negative liberty and positive state. When he differentiated human action into two frames, one is self-regarding and other-regarding, and believed that the state has every right to interfere in the affairs of society if any action of individual, that is other-regarding action, leads to certain consequences, then a state is free to interfere. So therefore, on the one hand, for liberty, he created a negative understanding of liberty. For a state, he had a very positive view of the state, that a state has to act, because earlier the state was simply banished from economy and society. It had only to provide the kind of role a night watchman provides. But John Stuart Mill perhaps differed with this understanding, and therefore, along with John Stuart Mill, we also have had other traditions like utilitarians, like James, like Bentham, who believed in pleasure pain calculus, who had a utilitarian understanding of a state, that a state is important because it is useful, it serves the interest of the people, and therefore that negative view of state was a little bit toned down. Then of course we have had Green and many other thinkers who provided some scope for state intervention in social and economic matters. So this is how the liberal tradition moved from laissez-faireism to this phase. In fact, what happened, that interwar period in 20th century became very important from the point of view of liberal theory, because a new understanding of a state crystallized, and largely on account of this great economic depression of 1920s and 30s. And it is here that political economist Keynes and his entire theory becomes important. It is in this context that Roosevelt, the American president, and his New Deal becomes important. And therefore, what happened subsequently was the emergence of a new model of a state, which is known as a welfare state, when a state was given a right to intervene in economic affairs, unlike the laissez-faireism which had completely banished it. So therefore, what happened, that in the interwar period, a new understanding of a state, new role of a state, new functions of a state were attributed. And it is in this context that Harold Lasky, the Fabian socialist, who also had a brush with Marxism, who is basically known for many of his contributions in political theory, came forward and offered his views on the nature of democratic state. And it is in this context that the Fabian socialism, this entire school which emerged in Europe, believing in social democracy, that democracy not only in political matters but also in social and economic sphere. So therefore, this Fabianism, and the proliferation of this new idea of social democracy in Europe, which I will be discussing in context of Marxism as well, particularly the differences in debate between Marxism and the Social Democrats, in fact created a new understanding of state so far as the modern period is concerned. And interestingly, many of these new ideas, the welfare state, the Fabianism, also influenced many leaders from the third world countries like Nehru. Who was greatly influenced by this new understanding of the state, which deviated both from the liberal as well as the Soviet Marxist framework of so far as the functioning of the state is concerned. That how a state in a democratic setup can function for the welfare of the people. And it is in this context that this model became quite popular in the third world countries. But 1970s, what happened, that another major change happened so far as the understanding of a state is concerned and the functioning of a state is concerned in comparative politics. It was largely on account of recession, global recession, economic recession. It started in the United States of America, what is normally referred as stagflation, inflation as well as stagnation in economy. It was also the consequence of OPEC crisis, the oil producing countries and their entire decision to increase the prices. So OPEC crisis. Then there were other changes between gold and dollar, particularly IMF and World Bank, the two institutions which emerged after Second World War, known as Bretton Woods institutions. And then of course there was some crisis in some African countries, the debt crisis, the debt trap in which they landed, and the kind of structural adjustment program which was suggested by IMF and World Bank for these countries to tide over their crisis. All these things, particularly the crisis of exchange rate stabilization, all these issues basically resulted into a new policy discourse which basically transformed this entire understanding of a state in comparative politics, in political economy, and in the global politics. And it is here in this context one should remember that this period was also known, this period is also known for the two advisors who were advising two very important political functionaries in the world. One was Friedman, who was the advisor of Ronald Reagan, the American president, and Hayek, who was the advisor of Margaret Thatcher, the Prime Minister of England. And Thatcherism and Reaganomics, as it was called in political economy, along with the contributions or the advisories which were given by the Chicago School, led to a new discourse so far as the state and its role is concerned, and this is what we call normally a neoliberal emergence of neoliberal state, which basically believed in free market economy, hidden hands of the market, like the classical political economist Adam Smith had argued. It believed in minimal role of the state, the minimalist version of the state. It believed in libertarian policies, libertarian theory, which Nozick and many others were basically pushing for, and therefore what we find that this new understanding of state crystallized in comparative politics. In fact, in India also 1991, the economic crisis led to new churning, new policy discourse, which is known as new economic policy, economic reforms, liberalization, privatization, and so on and so forth. And all these things coincided with globalization of 90s. Particularly after the disintegration of Soviet Union, after the Gulf War, and after the world started becoming unipolar, that is United States of America's dominance in the world was well acclaimed and accepted, and it was in this context that globalization, the argument for globalization happened. The globalization, of course, as a term was new, but the process of free trade policy with the formation of World Trade Organization in 1995. This was not new. Earlier also world had witnessed such argument for free trade, no barriers, no tariff, etc. and etc. So therefore liberalization, globalization and privatization, as it was called in India so far as the new economic reform was concerned, was also associated with the similar discourse which was being basically pushed by was being basically popularized by IMF and World Bank. So this was a new understanding of state now, that what role state has to play in context of market situation, because it believed that the market has its inbuilt logic to govern, and therefore state has to only offer supporting hands. In fact, most of the public sector units in India were disinvested. A policy of disinvestment started. State started washing off its hands from the economy. So it was not only in India, but many other countries, as I mentioned, started in United States with Reagan, Thatcher in England, Hayek and Friedman as economists, and then of course this debt trap crisis in Africa, and gradually it spread in different parts of the world. But along with this, there was another model so far as the comparative politics is concerned on a state, and this was the East Asian model, which was to a great extent a very interesting model. It was combination of market mechanism with authoritarianism, because normally it is believed that for democracy free market is necessary. This is what thinkers like Hayek, this is what Nozick, Friedman, contemporary liberals as it is called, and the classical liberals, both of them argued that there are certain prerequisites of democracy. One of them is existence of choices, both political and economic, and for choices you need freedom, and that freedom can exist only in market situation. So therefore market economy is something which is one of the important requirement, precondition for democracy. So therefore freedom in marketplace, freedom in politics, multi-party democracy, institutions, constitutionalism, these are the requirements. But this East Asian model basically symbolized something very different. On the one hand, it believed in free market economy, unregulated market, no state intervention, but then there was no scope for a multi-party system, constitutionalism, democratic institutions, rule of law, independence of judiciary. Rather, it coexisted with authoritarianism, authoritarian state. So therefore, this East Asian model, in fact, was called Asian tigers at one point of time because the kind of economic growth they attained. Singapore, Taiwan, Korea, many other countries in Asia, particularly East Asia, and Southeast Asia, they basically stood for this new version of the functions of the state, which was a combination of market and authoritarianism. So therefore, this was another. Next, of course, was the socialist model, which I had discussed earlier also. The Soviet Union was the first instance, along with its allies in East Europe. Later on, it traveled to Latin America, Cuba, Nicaragua. Then, of course, 1949, the Chinese Revolution. So initially, the Chinese Revolution with some differences because of the ideas of Mao and of Lenin in Soviet Union. But later on, interestingly, 1978, after economic reforms in China, Deng Xiaoping and his entire economic reforms created a new situation, a new model, which is still matter for research and investigation for scholars in comparative politics. Because what China has done, that again, like other East Asian countries, it has gone for a market economy. Of course, a different understanding of market, unlike other East Asian countries, because it is regulated and not regulated at the same time. In certain matters it is free, but in certain matters under the control of the party, one party ruled state, that is the Communist Party of China. So therefore, this coexistence of market along with and different type of authoritarianism, which is basically drawing on the idea of dictatorship of proletariat within Marxism, or one can say one party rule. So there is no existence of multi-party system. There is no constitutionalism in the liberal sense of the terms. There is no rule of law as it is perhaps understood in liberal democratic tradition. But nonetheless, they have a constitution, they have a set of laws, and of course they have elections, but not within multi-party system. There is only one party monopoly on power, that is the Communist Party of China, and therefore this market economy coexisting with this situation and resulting into phenomenal growth, so much so that China is predicted to be going in direction of becoming the most powerful economy, rather the superpower, in fact even leaving behind United States of America and many other European countries. So this is another model so far as the state functions of a state is concerned, where you have coexistence of market and authoritarianism. So therefore, in fact these are some of the contemporary situations, some contemporary theories and some of the debates which are going on. In fact, of course, in recent years we have also heard about two other characterizations that is also important. One is the failed state, another is the rogue state. The failed state idea emerged aftermath of 9/11 crisis, when the trade tower was hit by some terrorist outfits, and therefore some of the states which became who were harboring or basically who were promoting terrorist groups on their territory and were not in a position to control them. In fact, they were not even in position to provide the basic needs of the people. So they were characterized as failed state. And under this category of failed state, at times in our neighbor Pakistan is also referred as a failed state. So therefore, there are many failed states in the world. On the other hand, there was a concept of rogue state, and rogue state were the states who were basically defying international morality, international law and international organizations. They are not only defying, but they consider themselves above all these morality, all ethical norms of international politics. And here particularly till the Taliban were ruling Afghanistan, they were called as a rogue state, and recently the North Korean state is considered a rogue state, which defies all canons of international law, which doesn't believe in international morality. It doesn't believe in global committee of nations, and therefore they are referred as a rogue state. So these are different characterizations of a state as we find within comparative politics. But at the same time, there are other characterizations also for state capitalism. Charles Bethlehem and others who refer to Soviet Union as a state capitalist system. That capitalism where you have classes who appropriate surplus. There is a exploitation by one class of another within capitalism. But here they said that it was a state which was acting like a capitalist. A state was appropriating surplus. So this was one characterization of a state in context of the socialist societies. So therefore, this entire idea of state capitalism. Then there is a concept of developmental state, that there are other states which basically act in a manner where they intervene in economy, they perform the role of classes in order to develop the economy, in order to generate surplus, and inappropriate surplus generate resources. Even Indian state at times is referred as a developmental state. So there is another characterization of that sort. Yesterday I was in my last lecture I was mentioning about Ronald Chilcott, who is a very eminent a scholar of comparative politics, he offers three other characterization. One is a pluralist capitalist state, and this is of course within the liberal tradition itself. When scholars believe a state as a political marketplace and looks at a state as an agency which filters the demand and interest of the people, and is considered a state as a neutral agency. So there is nothing new in this, because it resembles what perhaps the liberal theory believes in, the neutrality of the state. Then there is institutional perspective. Krasner, as a scholar who basically believed in this institutional perspective, I believe the range of options which are available to the ruling dispensation are largely on account of this institutional capability of the state. So therefore, institutional perspective tries to analyze a state from the point of view of institutions, its vibrancy, its capability, and its growth. In fact, at one point of time when Huntington talked about institutional decay, he was also hinting at this. Then there is a corporatist perspective. Schmitter, 1971, in context of Brazil, he basically highlighted this understanding. He believed that planning is important to capitalism, because earlier there was no scope for planning. But he said that gradually planning became important for capitalism, and planning needs income policy, and income policy requires consensus among the affected parties in order to bring stability and normalcy in society. Thus a corporatist compromise happens, and that compromise happens between labor and capital, and it involves through intervention of a state. A state intervenes to bring about this compromise between capital and labor, and therefore the state becomes a corporatist state, acts like a corporate. Then there is an understanding of a state as a bureaucratic authoritarianism, and here in fact Gilnara or Daniel, particularly 1988, he talked about this bureaucratic authoritarianism in context of Argentina of 60s and 70s, in Latin American context, that how this bureaucratic authoritarianism is the best way to characterize a state, because crisis of import substitution policy, because many countries around that time went for this import substitution in order to push industrialization, and that import substitution policy led to a weak national bourgeoisie, and therefore because of the presence of weak national bourgeoisie, the state landed in crisis, and therefore in fact in this transitional phase a bureaucratic authoritarianism surfaced. So this is how Chulkot talks about these different perspectives within liberal tradition, that how scholars from time to time have tried to analyze it. Of course, in context of post-colonial state, there is also understanding of overdeveloped state, and I had mentioned earlier about Hamza Alavi and his writings on India and Pakistan, that how in these countries state as superstructure is more developed than the base, and therefore what happens that it gives some autonomy to state institutions from the different contending classes. Of course, in fact, in India, from the liberal point of view, Rajni Kothari also produced a work, Politics in India, where he believed in the autonomous role of elites and the state agencies for the development of the economy and for the progress of society. Of course, later on he abandoned his model when he wrote another book, A State Against Democracy. In fact, there was also debate about relative autonomy of a state in India among some Marxist scholars, particularly Pranab Bardhan and Ashok Rudra and many others. So therefore, these are some of the understandings of a state. Now coming to this Marxism, as I was mentioning, that Marxism has contributed handsomely on this issue of a state as perhaps liberalism. Normally it is believed that Marxism, there is a monolithic discourse, but that is not true. Even Marx, one can say that there are a number of arguments so far as state is concerned. One is of course the instrumentalist state, instrumentalist version of a state, which one finds in Communist Manifesto. But the Communist Manifesto was a pamphlet, and therefore what happened that Communist Manifesto was just a pamphlet, but apart from Communist Manifesto, I mentioned that the Greek, I mentioned that 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte, which is altogether different discourse within Marxism so far as state is concerned, when it talks of relative autonomy of a state, that when there are balance of class forces, when there is no class in a position to control the state, there is a total evenly match the strength of various classes. Around that time, state attains some autonomy in order to serve the larger interest of the capitalist structure. So therefore, this Bonapartist state, the Louis Bonaparte, the nephew of Napoleon, around 1851, around that time, the kind of state he controlled. In fact, that was the issue for Marx, and he called it the Louis Bonaparte state, and the relative autonomy theory comes in that context. Then there is another debate between a smash theory versus seizure theory. One is the withering away of the state, what Engels talked of. Another is the seizure of the state, that you seize the state and turn it into the dictatorship of the proletariat. This is what happened in Soviet Union, and it is attributed to Lenin. Lenin is also criticized by a number of scholars. In fact, Lenin, the entire argument of dictatorship of proletariat is attributed to Lenin, and many scholars believe that Marx perhaps didn't believe in dictatorship of the proletariat. But Lenin popularized it. Similarly, there is another debate between this structuralist and the instrumentalist. As I was talking earlier, Miliband-Polonja debate. Miliband, who wrote that famous book, State in the Capitalist Society, in that book he talked about the functioning of the capitalist economy, and therefore he believed that how a state acts as an instrument, and reiterating what the classical Marxism believed in. Now, Polonja, who was ardent ideological follower of Althusser, the German structuralist, believed that it is not that simple. A state functions to a number of ideological state apparatuses, and therefore Althusser's idea of over-determination influenced even Polonja's, and Polonja believed in the relative autonomy of the state, not simply in a mechanical instrumentalist version which Miliband was popularizing. So this debate became very lively between Miliband and Polonja, that how in advanced capitalist societies a state functions. Now, there was another important debate within Marxism after this Gramsci came forward with this idea of hegemony, that how ruling class rules. Ruling class doesn't simply rule through coercion, the coercive state apparatus, but it also rules by generating and manufacturing consent in civil society. Ideological state apparatus here becomes very important. Schools, church, clubs, etc., and people give consent for their rule, and therefore ruling class simply doesn't control the means of production, but also control the means of or one can say that control the mind of the people. So therefore Gramsci's contribution is as equally important. Now there are many other issues within classical Marxism, but because of paucity of time it cannot be touched, particularly the debate between Marx and German social democrat Lassalle. His debate with Bakunin, the anarchist, on what type of a state should exist in a socialist society, in a future society. German Democrats believe that a state with universal adult franchise can be transformed in the interest of the people, but Marxism didn't believe in this. Of course, later on, Claude, Oppe, Habermas, and others have also contributed so far as this entire debate on state is concerned in comparative politics. Therefore, debate goes on, and it still remains a very interesting theme for comparative politics.
With this note, thank you, sir. Thank you so very much for your deep and crucial inputs to the lecture. Friends, if you want to see the lecture once more, then we would like to tell you all that we are going to upload this lecture on YouTube soon. So keep watching us, keep writing us, and yes, for writing us, do write to us at info.cec@nic.in. We would be meeting again soon. Till then, take care. Goodbye. Thank you, sir. Thank you once again.